My name is Lon. I'm 68 years old. I live alone in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. These days, my life is filled with little routines. A cup of jasmine tea every morning, tending to the rose bushes in the garden, and reading the same old Vietnamese poetry books I've kept since my youth. Sometimes the silence feels peaceful. Other times, it echoes too loudly. 5 years ago, my husband Thien passed away. A sudden stroke in the middle of the night took him away before I could even say goodbye. Since then, the house has felt bigger, emptier. My son David calls from time to time, usually when he's on his way to work or when the kids are in the backseat of the car, distracted by cartoons. It's always a kind voice, but rushed and short. That morning, while sorting through the usual stack of mail, grocery flyers, utility bills, and medication catalogs, I found something different. A thick cream-colored envelope. Elegant, familiar handwriting. I held it for a second longer than I should have, just letting my fingers feel its weight. Inside was a short note from David. He was hosting a family day at the community center next Sunday. A potluck. Everyone was invited. The kids wanted to see me. I read the note 3 times, then pressed it gently to my chest. It had been months since I was last invited to anything. Christmas had come and gone. I had brought homemade banchan wrapped in banana leaves and watched silently as my daughter-in-law slid them into the fridge without comment, then served store-bought cookies instead. But this invitation, it felt different, like a door opening, if only slightly. Maybe this was my chance to be part of something again. To not just be the mother who quietly wires birthday money or sends handwritten cards no one mentions receiving. I went into my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Folded carefully in layers of tissue and lavender sachets was the AO dye I had kept for decades. Emerald green silk with hand-embroidered golden lotus flowers climbing up the hem and sleeves. Thien had given it to me on our wedding day. He said I looked like the goddess of spring. I hadn't worn it since his funeral. Holding it brought back everything. The day we got married, the nights I held David when he was sick, the Tet celebrations, the anniversaries, the quiet strength I felt whenever I wore it. It wasn't just clothing, it was memory, identity, love stitched into every thread. I held it up to my body in front of the mirror. My reflection had changed. More silver in my hair, deeper lines around my eyes. But the woman staring back still had grace, still had dignity. I smiled just a little. I would wear it. I ironed the AO dye carefully over the next few days, steam rising like breath from the past. I prepared cha gio the way my mother had taught me, meticulous, rolled tight, crispy golden brown. I bought peonies at the florist, remembering how David used to pluck their petals as a child, calling them flower clouds. Everything was almost ready. That night before family day, I laid out the AO dye and placed the spring rolls in neat containers. I looked around the house, quiet as always, but for once, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt full of hope, of memories, of something new beginning. I told myself I wouldn't expect anything. No compliments, no attention, no grand reunions. I would go. I would bring my food, wear my AO dye, and show up fully as myself. Because after all these years, I had realized something. I didn't need permission to belong. I already did. The morning of family day arrived with clear skies and gentle sun. I woke up early, like I used to when David was still small. I brewed jasmine tea, laid out the spring rolls in a woven basket lined with banana leaves, and carefully zipped the AO dye into its garment bag. Everything was in order. I dressed slowly, deliberately. The AO dye slid over my shoulders like a whisper from the past. I secured my hair in a soft bun, applied a touch of powder and lip balm, and looked at myself one last time in the mirror. My heart was calm, but underneath that calm was a small, nervous tremble. It had been so long since I had stepped into a space full of people, especially people who knew me, yet didn't really see me anymore. I arrived early at the community center. The parking lot was already half full. Children ran across the grass with balloons in their hands. A banner that read, Family Day, flapped in the breeze above the main entrance. Inside, it was bright and bustling. Tables were arranged in a wide semicircle. Each family had a place, marked with a small sign. I found ours Nguyen family in the back corner. I placed my basket gently on the table and began arranging the food. My hands moved automatically, folding napkins, setting small dipping bowls, arranging the flowers I had brought. I wanted it to feel like home. Then I heard my name. Grandma. Two small arms wrapped around my waist. It was Ellie, my granddaughter, 8 years old, missing her front tooth. Her brother, Theo, followed right behind, holding a toy dinosaur in one hand and a juice box in the other. I smiled so wide I thought my face might crack. They chatted excitedly, telling me about their school projects, their cat, a cartoon I didn't recognize. I nodded and listened, letting their voices fill the quiet places inside me. David arrived next. He gave me a quick hug, one of those side embraces people give when they're not sure how to express affection. His wife, Emily, followed with a polite nod. She glanced at my outfit and smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look traditional," she said, adjusting her sunglasses on her head. I smiled, choosing not to read into it. As more people arrived, the noise grew. The hall buzzed with conversations, the clinking of dishes, the shrieks of children. Someone started a playlist of old American pop songs from the 80s. People laughed, posed for photos, shared stories. I stood at our table, watching it all. That's when it started. I didn't hear the first comment clearly, only caught the tail end of a sentence. "Looks like something out of a museum." There was a chuckle. Then another voice added, "I didn't know we were doing costume day." They weren't talking to me, but they weren't being quiet either. I turned and saw a group of women, David's co-workers' wives, maybe, standing just a few tables away. One of them looked right at me as she whispered something to another. Both laughed softly. Their eyes flicked up and down, settling on the golden embroidery along my sleeves. I felt it like a prick to the chest. David was chatting with someone else. Emily was showing a video on her phone to another parent. No one noticed. I stood straighter, smiled again, picked up a serving spoon and began offering food to passing guests. It got worse when the event organizer, a young woman in a cheery floral dress, walked by with a camera and said, "Would you like to take a photo? Maybe just the grandkids. Unless Grandma wants to take off the outfit?" She said it kindly, even sweetly. But the word outfit landed with a sting. Not AODI, not dress, just outfit. Ellie looked confused. "But Grandma looks pretty." The photographer blinked. "Oh, yes, of course. Very unique." David laughed awkwardly. "You know, Mom, always doing things her own way. That hurt more than it should have. Doing things my own way. Was it really so strange, so laughable, to wear a piece of myself?" I didn't say anything. I just smiled for the camera, holding my granddaughter close, pretending not to notice that I had become a background character in my own family's gathering. As people passed by, they took spring rolls. A few complimented the flavor, but none asked who made them. No one asked about the AO dye, about its story, about the woman inside it. And slowly, the smile I wore began to crack. When the event ended, people packed up quickly. I cleared the table alone. Emily was already outside with the kids, and David was talking to someone by the door. I folded the linen, tucked the leftover food into containers, and picked up the flowers. I felt invisible. Just another old woman at the edge of the party. Just someone who does things her own way. I drove home in silence. Not angry. Not sad, exactly. Just tired. When I reached my front door, I didn't go in immediately. I stood on the porch, AO dye still on, the last rays of the afternoon sun catching the gold threads on my sleeves. And I whispered to myself, not in bitterness, but in quiet clarity, "They don't see you, but you are not gone. You are not less." I walked inside, closed the door, and sat by the window. And in that silence, something shifted. I didn't need their approval. But I didn't need to do something for myself and for the girl I once was, standing at the altar in this very same AO dye, dreaming of a life where she mattered. I would find a way to make this story mean something. Even if they didn't see me, the world would. The AO dye hung by the window the next morning, catching soft light like a memory refusing to fade. I hadn't put it away. I couldn't. It was no longer just a piece of fabric. It had become a mirror, one that showed me who I still was underneath the years of being dismissed, overlooked, and smiled at out of politeness. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The house was quiet as always, but not empty. Not anymore. Something inside me was stirring, faint but insistent. The laughter from the women at Family Day echoed in my memory, not out of pain this time, but clarity. For years, I had tolerated that tone, that subtle mockery wrapped in pleasantries. I had played the part of the agreeable mother, the grateful mother-in-law, the harmless grandmother. But that woman in the AO die, the one they chuckled at, she had survived war, immigration, widowhood, and motherhood. She had built a life out of scraps and silence. They didn't laugh at a costume. They laughed at a story they didn't bother to understand. I stood and walked toward the garment, ran my fingers along the lotus blossoms once again, and whispered, "You deserve better." That afternoon I called Mai. She was my closest friend since high school. Another woman with silver hair and a spine of steel beneath her soft laughter. We hadn't spoken in a few months, but when she picked up, it was as if no time had passed. "You still have your AO die, don't you?" I asked. There was a pause. Then she laughed. "Of course. Why?" "I want to do something with mine," I said slowly. "I want to auction it. For charity." Another pause. "Lon, are you sure?" "I'm not doing it out of bitterness," I said. "I want to give it a new story. One that matters. I want to turn that moment when they laughed into something beautiful." She was quiet for a second. "Then, let's do it together." We met 2 days later at her apartment. We laid out both our AO die on her kitchen table like old friends returning home. Hers was crimson red with delicate cherry blossoms blooming across the collar. We spent hours sewing tiny mended spots, ironing, cleaning, restoring them with the kind of love you reserve for old things that have carried too much. We made flyers, posted on local Facebook groups, contacted the Vietnamese Community Center downtown, told them we wanted to organize a silent auction, with proceeds going toward scholarships for young girls of Vietnamese descent who couldn't afford college. Something for the next generation of women, so they could grow up proud of where they came from, of the mothers and grandmothers who carried history on their backs. At first, the response was small. A few kind comments, a few interested replies, but then someone shared our post. Then another. Then someone from a local paper reached out for an interview. And before we knew it, the story had caught fire. Not a big fire, not viral, but enough to warm a room full of hearts. Women started messaging us. Not just Vietnamese women, but women from all backgrounds. Some had old dresses, scarves, wedding gowns, even aprons, objects that meant something to them, that carried their mother's or grandmother's fingerprints. They wanted to donate them, share their stories. What began as 2 AO die on a kitchen table became a movement. We called it Threaded Lives. The day of the auction came on a cool Saturday in early spring. The sun was soft, the breeze kind. The community center was decorated with strings of lights and photo displays of the garments being auctioned. Each one had a card attached, not listing its value in dollars, but its history, its meaning. Mine read, "Worn for love, worn for loss. Mocked once, but never again. This dress fed a child, held a husband, buried a husband. It is not for show. It is for legacy." As I stood by my AO die, I saw people reading the card with tears in their eyes. A woman about my age came and took my hand. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not staying silent." I saw Ellie, my granddaughter, tugging at David's sleeve. "That's Grandma's dress," she said proudly, "the one everyone laughed at." David looked at me. Our eyes met. He walked over. "Mom," he began, "I didn't know it meant that much to you." "It didn't," I said quietly. "Not until they made it small." That's when I remembered how big it really is. He looked at the AO die, at the card, then back at me. "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I know." The bidding began. My AO die sold for $5,000, bought by a woman who wanted it displayed in her daughter's cultural studies classroom. She said it reminded her of her own mother, long gone, who used to sew dresses by candlelight during wartime. I watched as they gently placed it in a protective case, not tucked away in shame, but preserved with honor. And in that moment, I didn't feel tired. I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, not because of the money, not because of the applause, but because I had turned something small, something hurtful, into something lasting. I looked over at my granddaughter again, eyes wide, cheeks flushed, her hand clutched tightly around a flyer that read, "Threaded lives, one stitch can change a story." And I knew. We had just begun writing a new one. The Monday after the auction felt different. The sunlight that spilled through the kitchen window had a warmth to it I hadn't noticed in months. I sat at my small table, sipping tea, rereading a thank you note written in the neat cursive of a teenage girl named Thien, one of the first scholarship recipients. "Dear Madam, I have never owned an AO die. My mother never did either. She said there was never money, and later, never time. But because of you, I will go to university. I'll wear my culture with pride, not on fabric, maybe, but in every word I write. Thank you for honoring your past and making way for our future." I read it 3 times and wept, not because I was sad, but because I had finally felt useful again, needed, part of something that mattered beyond the walls of my small house. The days that followed were full of messages from women I'd never met. They sent photos of old heirlooms and garments passed down through generations. One woman mailed me a scarf her grandmother had worn when fleeing Saigon in 1975. Another sent a faded apron from her mother's bakery in Los Angeles. These weren't just clothes. They were testaments, stories wrapped in cloth, proof that women, quiet, strong, and often forgotten, had always been the backbone of every home, every meal, every silence. And somehow our little project had become a space where those women could finally speak. But not all the messages came from strangers. One night, I heard a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there stood Emily, David's wife, holding a plate of homemade cookies and a bottle of wine. "Hi," she said sheepishly. "I thought maybe we could talk." I blinked. "Of course. Come in." We sat in the living room, the plate untouched between us. She looked nervous, unsure. "I owe you an apology," she began. "At Family Day, I laughed. Not out loud, but inside. I saw the AO die, and I thought it was dramatic." She winced at her own words. "But then the article came out," she continued, voice quieter. "And I read your quote, about how women carry history on their backs. And I cried. I cried because I thought of my own mother, how she worked nights, how she wore the same cardigan for 10 years so I could go to camp." I stayed silent, letting her speak. "I've been so caught up in fitting in," she said. "At school, with the other parents in the city, I forgot to honor where I came from. And worse, I tried to downplay where you came from. I didn't want David to see it either, I think. Because maybe if he remembered how strong you were, he'd expect that from me too." There it was, the vulnerability. I reached for her hand. "You don't have to carry shame for forgetting," I said gently. "We all forget sometimes. What matters is what we do when we remember." She nodded, eyes glistening. "I'd like to help with the next auction," she said. "If you'll have me." I smiled. "Of course, but no store-bought cupcakes this time." We both laughed, real, warm laughter that lifted the air between us. That night, after she left, I walked into my bedroom and opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were old photographs, letters from David when he was in college, and at the very bottom, a necklace. Gold, delicate, with a single jade stone. Graham had given it to me after David was born. I hadn't worn it since the funeral. But that night, I clasped it around my neck. Not out of mourning, but memory. He would have loved this chapter of my life. He always said I was strongest when I was quiet, but fiercest when I was brave. I looked in the mirror, hand resting lightly on the jade pendant. "You'd be proud, wouldn't you?" I whispered. No voice answered, but somehow I felt it. The house no longer felt heavy with absence. It felt full, with stories, with purpose, with beginnings that had bloomed from endings. Later that week, David called. Not a text, not an email, a real call. "Hi, Mom," he said. "I've been thinking about everything. The auction, your story. I didn't realize how much of you I never bothered to learn." His voice faltered. "I want to change that," he said. Would you come over for dinner Sunday? Ellie wants to hear about when you were a little girl. She's got questions. I closed my eyes. Let that sink in. Yes, I said. Tell her I'll bring stories. And dessert. Sunday came with the smell of jasmine and the sound of birdsong outside my window. I stood in front of my wardrobe, carefully selecting my outfit. Not out of vanity, but intention. I wanted to wear something that reminded me of who I was and who I had always been. I chose a soft beige blouse, pressed slacks, and a silk scarf with hand-embroidered cranes that my mother had once sewn. I placed my hand briefly over my heart before I left. The jade pendant still hung there, a quiet anchor. When I arrived at David and Emily's house, Ellie opened the door. Grandma, she beamed, arms thrown around my waist. I hugged her tightly. Her embrace was so different from her mother's, still innocent, still full of belief that the world was kind and soft. Inside, the dinner table was set simply. Rice, soup, sautéed greens. Comfort food. The kind of meal I used to make when David was small. For a moment, a lump rose in my throat, but I pushed it down gently. Ellie has questions, David said after we had eaten, a faint smile on his face. Lots of them. Ellie dragged a chair closer to mine, legs swinging. Grandma, were you always strong? The question took me by surprise. No, I said slowly. I think I started strong, but life tried to make me smaller. And then I remembered who I was. She blinked. How do you forget who you are? I chuckled softly. By putting everyone else first for too long. Sometimes, grown-ups forget their people too. Ellie nodded solemnly. The way only children do when they pretend to understand something vast. Did you wear AO dye when you were my age? I did. It was blue. My mother made it for me with her own hands. I wore it until the seams came loose. What happened to it? I smiled. It became part of the wind. I imagine it's still floating somewhere over the Mekong, whispering all the secrets I once told it. Ellie's eyes widened. Can I have one too? An AO dye. I paused, then nodded. Yes, and I'll help you choose the fabric myself. Across the table, David was quiet, but his eyes were on me, not with judgment or indifference this time, but with something closer to wonder, maybe even regret. Mom, he said quietly, I've been thinking about Dad a lot lately. He would have loved this, wouldn't he? I looked at him. He would have teased me about the auction, but he would have driven across the country to be there. We both laughed. Emily brought out dessert, che, sweet and warm, with tapioca pearls and banana slices, a dish I hadn't made in years. I followed your recipe, she said nervously. Hope I didn't mess it up. I took a bite and smiled. It's perfect. There was a quiet after that, the kind that isn't awkward, but comforting. Like a soft blanket over old wounds. Later, as I packed up my purse to leave, David walked me to the door. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, his voice low. Not just for Family Day, but for not asking sooner. About your life, your stories, your pain. I turned to him. It's not too late, Con. He nodded. I know. I want Ellie to grow up proud. Of you. Of all of this. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Then start by showing her how to listen. That night, as I returned to my home, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because the silence that once weighed heavy in my house had become gentle. Like a friend, I changed into my pajamas, lit a stick of incense, and sat by the window with my diary. Today I told stories, and they listened, not because I was loud, but because I finally stopped whispering. The wind outside picked up. I closed my eyes, and somewhere in that breeze, I swear, I could feel my mother's AO dye fluttering again. A few mornings later, I opened my email and found a message with the subject line, Your story changed my life. It was from a woman named Hoa Nguyen, a second-generation Vietnamese American living in Oregon. She had read the article about my AO dye auction. She wrote of her estranged relationship with her mother, how they hadn't spoken in 3 years. But after reading my story, she had called her mother just to say thank you. Your courage reminded me that our mothers are often the keepers of a history we don't take time to understand, she wrote. I'm sorry it took me this long. Thank you for reminding me to look back before it's too late. I sat back in my chair, the screen glowing gently in the early light. One story, one thread of cloth, and yet it was stitching hearts back together across oceans. That evening, I called Sister Twee from the community center. She had once invited me to speak to a small women's circle, but I had declined, unsure of what I had to offer. Now I was ready. A week later, I stood in front of a group of 12 women, most over 50, sitting in a circle with their hands folded quietly in their laps. Some wore floral prints, others wore traditional AO dye. Some looked nervous, others weary. I took a deep breath. My name is Lynn. I am 73 years old, and for most of my life, I thought being silent was the only way to survive. They listened. I told them about Family Day, about the look on my daughter-in-law's face, about the ache of being dismissed in a room full of people you once built your world around. I told them about the auction, the jade necklace, the rediscovery of my voice. And when I finished, one woman wiped her eyes. Another spoke. My daughter refuses to speak Vietnamese now. She says it's embarrassing, that it makes her classmates stare. I know that shame, I said softly. I used to carry it too, until I realized it was never mine to begin with. From that meeting, something bloomed. Each week, more women came. We brought heirlooms, cooked old recipes, taught one another how to mend, to dye, to embroider, skills our mothers had passed down and we had tucked away like secrets. We named the group No Na, Remembering Home. It wasn't a formal nonprofit. No paperwork, no donors, just women, gathering to remember who they were before the world told them to be smaller. And something beautiful happened. One woman, Hung, who hadn't spoken in front of a crowd in years, read a poem about her mother's hands. Another, Tao, brought in her wedding AO dye, still fragrant with old perfume and rain. She had kept it in a suitcase for 40 years. We cried, we laughed, and slowly we healed. Then Emily suggested we share the stories online. You're changing lives, she said, helping me set up a Facebook page. Let's not keep it locked in this room. So we began posting photos of AO dye, recipes, reflections, even short clips of storytelling sessions. We called the page AO Dye Diaries. At first, it was just friends and family, then strangers, then thousands. Messages came pouring in, women in Australia, France, Canada, who had fled war, lost family, given birth in refugee camps, and raised children who no longer spoke their mother tongue. They thanked us for remembering what they were too tired to hold onto. One night, I got a message from a college student named Maya in Toronto. She was writing a thesis on generational trauma among Southeast Asian families. She asked to interview me. Me, not a professor, not a historian, a grandmother with a laptop and an old scarf draped over her chair. When the Zoom call began, she was in tears before I could even say hello. I just wanted to see your face, she said. You remind me of my Banagwai. I didn't get to say goodbye before she passed. I smiled gently. Then let's sit together a while. I'll light incense. You tell me a story, and we'll make space for her here. That night, I stayed up until 1 a.m., replying to messages from women I'd never met, but somehow already knew. We were all part of the same quilt, torn in places, faded in others, but stitched together by the unspoken strength of survival. The invitation came on a Wednesday morning, printed on thick ivory paper, sealed with golden foil. The Vietnamese Heritage Foundation cordially invites Ms. Lynn Tran to our annual cultural gala as guest of honor and keynote speaker. I had to read it 3 times. At first, I laughed, a small, disbelieving laugh, the kind that escapes when something feels too surreal to be real. I hadn't spoken into a microphone in decades. What would I even say? But then I looked over at my scarf, the one with the embroidered cranes, folded neatly on the back of my chair, and I thought of my mother, of her quiet hands, her fierce pride, her belief that our stories, no matter how painful, were worth carrying. So I said yes. The gala was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In those days, I worked with Mai, the student from Toronto, to craft my speech. She was patient, thoughtful, and had an eye for shaping memories into moments. Speak like you're telling Ellie a bedtime story, she told me. Except the whole room is Ellie. On the night of the event, I wore a new AO dye. Custom made by a young designer from Hue who had seen our Facebook page and insisted on gifting it. It was deep emerald green, with gentle white lotuses flowing up from the hem like a quiet river. As I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her shoulders were square, her spine tall, her gaze calm. At the venue, the crowd was larger than I expected. Hundreds of chairs, a ballroom glimmering with lights, tables dressed in white linen, each adorned with tiny bamboo centerpieces and floating candles. I felt my breath catch for a moment, but Emily, who had come with me, squeezed my hand. "You've already lived the story," she whispered. "Now you just have to share it." When the host introduced me, the room quieted. I stepped up to the podium, my notes trembling slightly in my hands. But then I looked out at faces both young and old, some expectant, some emotional, and the trembling stopped. I took a deep breath. When I was a girl, my mother used to say that fabric remembers the hands that touched it. She believed that every thread carried memory, that stitches were just another form of storytelling. I didn't understand her then. I thought she was being poetic. But years later, as I stood in front of a room of strangers, wearing my old AO dye while being laughed at, I remembered her words. And when I sold that AO dye for $5,000 to fund scholarships for girls who didn't yet know their own strength, I understood her completely. I am not here because I am special. I am here because I chose to stop being silent. And I believe every woman in this room carries a story that deserves to be heard. Not when she's perfect, not when she's young, but exactly as she is in the fullness of her years. The room was silent, and then applause. Not polite, not obligatory, raw, rising. After the speech, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She was in her 60s, dressed in a pale blue AO dye and wore her hair in a neat bun. "My daughter's here tonight," she said, her voice shaking, "and she never wanted to wear AO dye again. But after listening to you, she told me she wants one just like mine." I hugged her. Later, as I stepped outside for air, a breeze brushed past me, warm and gentle. I looked up at the night sky, full of soft stars. I thought of Graham, of the way he used to hold my hand when I was nervous. I whispered I did it. And somewhere inside, I felt a peace that wasn't quiet or distant, but radiant. A pride that didn't come from being recognized, but from being seen. Truly seen. 2 days after the gala, while I was watering the orchids on my balcony, my phone buzzed with a message I never expected. "Mom, can we talk? I saw the gala. I saw you. Melissa." I froze. Melissa. My daughter-in-law. The woman who once looked at my AO dye like it was a relic too embarrassing to be seen in public. The one who had called it outdated, who had laughed with her sister about my costume in front of a room full of family. I stared at the message for a long time, unsure what to feel. Was this guilt? Regret? A trap? But then I remembered the woman I had been on that stage. The woman I had become. So I wrote back, of course. "Come by Saturday. I'll make tea." When the day came, I lit incense early. Not for any grand ritual, just for calm. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of jasmine tea, when I heard the knock. Not hurried, not timid, just measured. I opened the door. Melissa stood there, holding a small container of sesame cookies and a bouquet of white lilies. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I didn't come to apologize." I nodded. "Good. I didn't ask for one." She blinked, startled, then let out a tiny, nervous laugh. "Fair." I gestured for her to come in. We sat at the table. The silence between us was thick, but not suffocating. Just full, like a room that hadn't been aired in years. "I watched the video of your speech," Melissa said. "It went viral in our circles. People keep forwarding it to me, saying, 'Is this your mother-in-law?' And I keep thinking, God, I didn't know her." I stirred my tea gently. "You never asked." She nodded. "I know. And I think I didn't want to. You intimidated me. Not because you were loud, but because you never needed to be." I tilted my head. "I was afraid of becoming you," she said. A woman who had given everything to her family and still ended up alone at a folding chair on family day. Those words stung, but they were also honest. I wasn't alone because I gave, I replied softly. I was alone because I was invisible. She looked down at her tea, quiet. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared I'm turning into someone I promised myself I'd never be. Someone who silences other women to feel more powerful. Someone who picks safety over compassion. I sipped my tea and said, the first step to changing that is to see it. And you just did. A long pause. Then she opened the cookie tin and slid it toward me. I made them using your recipe. The one you gave Ellie. She said yours still tastes better. I smiled. She's not wrong. We both laughed, really laughed, and something loosened between us. Melissa looked at me again, eyes softer now. Will you come back next family day? Not as a guest. Not in the corner. But at the head of the table. I didn't answer immediately. I looked out the window where sunlight was catching on the leaves just so, turning green into gold. Then I turned back to her. Yes, I said. But this time I'm wearing red. Her eyes lit up. That means celebration, right? No, I said, lips curling into a smile. It means power. Family Day arrived with a quiet kind of buzz in the air, like the morning knew something special was about to happen. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the red AO dye. Deep crimson with golden lotus flowers cascading down the side. I had it made by the same designer who gifted me the green one for the gala. This one, though, was mine, every stitch, every curve, every symbol chosen with care. Melissa came early to help Ellie get dressed. I watched from the hallway as my granddaughter twirled in her tiny pink AO dye, the silk catching light like ripples on water. You look like a little flame, I told her. She beamed. I want to match you, Grandma. Melissa smiled softly. She insisted on wearing one today. Said, if Grandma can wear hers in front of hundreds of people, I can wear mine for 30. We drove to the family center together. The same parking lot. The same hallway. The same long table covered in potluck dishes and disposable plates. But this time, I didn't hover at the back. I walked in, shoulders high, red AO dye flowing around me like a banner. And people noticed. Some stared. Some smiled. A few clapped gently as if unsure if they were allowed to. My son, Daniel, came toward me eyes wide. Mom, you look exactly as I should, I said and kissed his cheek. Melissa nudged him. She's our guest of honor. He laughed sheepishly. Finally, the event began with the usual chatter. Kids ran between tables. Grandparents passed around spring rolls. Someone played soft music from a speaker in the corner. Then the host stood and tapped a spoon against her glass. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone special, she said. A woman who reminded us that tradition is not a weight, but a gift. Ms. Lintran, would you say a few words? I hadn't planned to speak, but I stood anyway. I walked slowly to the front, heels clicking gently on the linoleum floor. I turned to face the room, not just a crowd, but my people. Last year, I sat in this same room. I wore an AO dye that was older than some of your children. I sat quietly, hoping no one would notice me. And they didn't. Not really. But this year, I came not to blend in, but to belong. Our culture is not just something we display on holidays. It's stitched into our skin, passed down in recipes, carried in lullabies, and worn in silk. Don't wait until your elders are gone to ask them who they are. Don't wait until your children grow up to show them where they come from. Wear your story while you're still here to tell it. The room was silent. Then applause. Real applause. Ellie ran up and hugged my waist. I'm gonna wear AO dye every year, she declared. I laughed, holding her close. As long as it makes you feel strong. That's all that matters. Later that afternoon, a younger woman, maybe in her 20s, approached me. She wore jeans, sneakers, and nervous eyes. I brought my AO dye today, she said quietly. It's in the car. I didn't think I'd be brave enough to wear it. Do you want to? I asked. She nodded. Then go, I said, touching her arm. Let it remind you where you come from. 15 minutes later, she returned. Pale lavender AO dye, slightly wrinkled from being folded, but radiant all the same. And around her, others smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true. That night, After all the plates were cleared and the laughter had faded into gentle goodbyes, I sat alone in my living room. The red AO dye hung over the back of the armchair, still holding the scent of jasmine and rice paper and spring air. I reached for the old wooden box I had kept since my 20s. Inside were yellowed letters, a photo of Graham holding baby Daniel, a handkerchief embroidered by my mother, and a tiny scrap of fabric from my very first AO dye, blue with silver threading, worn the day I graduated university. Everything I had ever loved, ever fought for, ever lost or reclaimed, it was here. All of it, quiet and soft but real. I thought about how far I'd come, from the folding chair in the corner of family day to the head of the table, from invisible to undeniable, from being mocked for my tradition to funding scholarships because of it. $5,000. That old AO dye I wore, the one they laughed at, it had become a symbol. The auction was meant to be a one-time thing. But since then, others had reached out, offering to donate their heirlooms, their garments, their family treasures to create a rotating scholarship fund. We called it the Silken Thread Fund. Every garment sold carried the story of the woman who wore it, and every dollar helped a girl become the woman she was meant to be. I didn't need to fight for space anymore. Now I held the door open, and Ellie, sweet, stubborn Ellie, was watching every step. She now asked questions about her heritage. She helped me fold dumplings. She listened when I told her that strength isn't always about speaking loud, but about knowing when to stand tall in silence. I had once been cast aside in a room full of my own family, but now I was being invited into classrooms, conferences, and kitchens to share what it meant to carry history in your hands. Because in a world obsessed with new, I had learned the power of old. And as I folded the red AO dye and placed it in a protective case, a case that would one day belong to Ellie, I whispered something my mother once told me. We do not disappear. We pass down. Just then, a message pinged on my phone. A girl from a community college in Houston, Vietnamese American, first generation. She wrote, I watched your story. My mom wears her AO dye to church, and I used to be embarrassed. But after seeing you, I asked her if we could take a picture together in them. She cried. Thank you for helping me see her. I wiped a tear from my cheek. And then I replied, thank you for letting her be seen. As the lights dimmed and the night deepened, I stood by the window, looking out over the quiet street. I no longer needed a crowd to feel worthy. I no longer needed permission to be proud. The world hadn't changed, but I had. And because of that, maybe, just maybe, the world would start to listen.